any kind of ideological shift that we engage in as a society, it entails negative consequences. There are, for every change in perspective, generally speaking, yes, there are positives, but then also there are negatives. And I think that we kind of as a society in some ways have sort of rushed in because we want to be tolerant, because we want people to live their best life. Like I do too, right? We want people to live their best life and feel accepted and not bullied and all of that. That I think sometimes we're too generous in sort of handing over the reins of our critical reasoning, or we're too we're not reluctant we're not as reluctant as we should be to sort of slow down at times and say, well, wait a minute, or I don't know, or are we sure we want to do this? Like all of these male athletes, biologically male athletes who are in, women's sports. I think that for the vast majority of people, they just see that that clearly doesn't make sense. And that's not right, And so that's what I would say. It used to be that conservatism, I'm talking long before, like the Republican Party or any of sort of our modern political binaries that we have today. The traditional, like classical definition of conservatism, like if you're going back to like Edmund Burke, and because really Edmund Burke is seen as being one of the fathers, or the father perhaps, of classical conservatism. And he was writing during the time of the French Revolution, when you had this really extraordinary upheaval in European society and in the French government and in the ages-old monarchical system. And so when the French Revolution occurred, there was, as you know, there was a lot of violence that unleashed these cycles of violence, and it took many, many years for all of this to get resolved. And Marie Antoinette, who by all accounts was not deserving of this, she got her head cut off. And think of, I mean, all of the innocent people in France whose heads were cut off. And so Edmund Burke, when he was writing some of his works about a more conservative perspective, back then the idea with conservatism was that conservatism was just meant to basically that one of the primary roles of a conservative perspective was to stand in front of the mob, was to slow the mob down, because the mob is what is going to scream and social upheaval and off with their heads and give me what I want and all of that. And sometimes the mob will be right and sometimes it won't, right? But the mob, it was understood that the mob could very easily get out of control, could get crazy, could get feverish, could get rabid, could be too quick to impose its own will, and that there needed to be people who were committed to the idea of standing between the mob and society and slowing it down, slowing down the radicals, slowing down the most adamant political zealots in society. And so the idea of conservative, like think of what the term conservative, if you take away our modern understandings. I'm just trying to give a history lesson here. I'm not arguing that people vote for DeSantis or whatever, right? I really am not. Like, I just think it's interesting how these definitions have changed. Same thing as the definition of the word liberal has changed, right, from what it used to mean. But if you think about, apart from these political associations that we have with it, if you think about what actually the term to be conservative means in everyday vernacular, right? Like, for instance, let's say that I was going to go into a job interview, and let's say that it was going to be an interview for maybe a very sort of traditional corporation or workplace. And so you might say to me, wear something conservative. Now, you're not telling me to put on the colors of the Republican Party. Okay. What you're saying is, don't wear something that's too out there or that shows too much or makes you look like sort of crazy in any one direction or too sexual or whatever, right? Dress conservative. And so the idea originally was sort of the Edmund Burkean conservatism that came out of the events of the French Revolution in response to that sort of rabid dynamic in which you just had heads getting chopped off right and left or whatever, metaphorically speaking and literally speaking. The idea of the conservative was to, just like someone might say, hey, let's tone down that crazy outfit, go more conservative. You might say, hey, let's tone down this crazy revolution. Let's go a little more conservative. We don't need to run into this woman's bedroom and try to drag her out of bed so that we can cut off her head. And so Edmund Burke actually famously wrote an essay about Marie Antoinette and about the idea of her being violated by this ravenous mob that's broken into her home. And it was very much a trying to garner sympathy for Marie Antoinette and for those people who, simply because of their status and wealth, were being summarily executed in France. Now, why am I talking about all of that? I'm just talking about it because I think it's interesting to get to the root of some of these terms and to understand how they've changed so much over time. But at the same time, there are these sort of older ideals that we can look to and we can sort of see the point in them, right? I think most people think the idea of being a classical conservative is like, oh, you're a fuddy duddy, you're no fun, right? Like, and I understand where that perspective comes from, right? This sort of like sour, like you're always against change. You're just like this, old like grandpa here telling us get off my lawn or whatever, right? And sure, that can be a part of it, but at the same time, you really don't always want the mob to get what it wants. You really don't always want society to move super super fast in the direction of sweeping changes. And it's interesting that it was the conservative side, generally speaking, that was resistant to what I think were some of the more authoritarian and totalitarian impulses in our response to COVID. And I'm not going to get into that right now unless somebody wants me to talk about it. But I think the worm is kind of turned on all that, and I think everybody kind of sees that. Well, not everybody. I think a lot of people see that there were issues in some of the infringements on people's freedoms and in some of these mandates and so forth. So I don't want to get back into that unless somebody really wants me to. Otherwise, I'll move on. But it was generally speaking people of a more conservative classification who were saying, "Hey, slow down. Let's put the brakes on this. Maybe we don't have to be this extreme."